Justin Boone is a lead fantasy analyst for The Score. He was Fantasy Pros' most accurate expert for 2019, and he's had 7 straight top 7 finishes within their rankings contest. He's a friend from north of the border, and he's one of the most rational voices in the fantasy football space. These are his late round perspectives. You know, we go through all off season and we study for this test, I always say, right? Like we got this big test coming up and we're just going crazy studying for it. And then we take the test, which is basically week 1. And it's really the biggest test of our year because we spent so much time researching this stuff. And then things just get kind of thrown out the window with a lot of the research that we do. And sometimes we fail. Sometimes we do all right. Sometimes we, get some B pluses instead of some D pluses with our answers. So one of the things I wanted to ask you though, we are only 2 weeks into the season. Do you think that it's too early to panic? How do you handle sort of the balance of analyzing some of these early season numbers versus all of that research that we did, from February until September?
I mean, I think it's so tough and nobody wants to hear this answer, but it's got to be case by case, right? You can't just come at it with a blanket statement and everything is going to get sorted out one way. That would be nice if that was the situation. That is definitely not the situation. And, there's a lot of players that got off to hot starts, but there's reasons for it. And maybe what we've seen in the first couple of weeks isn't true. There's a lot of players that have gone the other way. I mean, I think your Steelers are a perfect example where everyone's burying them right now. But look at the matchups that they've had in the first 2 weeks. They went against the 49ers defense, and then they went against the Browns defense. 49ers, certainly one of the best defenses in the league, if not the best. Maybe the Cowboys are putting up a pretty good argument to be that right now. And then the Browns, we're going to look back and say this Browns defense is incredibly legit. So I think it's really, really tough to try to make those decisions early in the season. And, you look at a team like the Steelers where it's so easy on Twitter for everyone to just put them down when in reality, there's so many other factors that go into it. And it's not just matchups, it's injuries that happen. I mean, some of the running backs that people are really hard on right now, well, the offensive line is hurt in front of them. So what do you expect these guys to do? And really anybody that you put in there is probably going to struggle. So I don't have a great answer. For me, normally I want 3 or 4 weeks of data, and then I start to feel a little more confident in my takes. And I think what you got to do is you have to act early in the season. You can't just sit back. We know that because if you sit back and you wait for those 3 or 4 weeks of data, you're going to be behind. You're not going to have any of these players that are breaking out in the first couple of weeks. So you got to make decisions. You got to move on it. I tend to be aggressive early in the year. This year, I might have made a couple mistakes, JJ, in terms of some of the recommended bids that I gave people in the first week after some of those players broke out. We're probably going to talk about some of those guys here, but yeah. I always like the idea of approaching the season in windows. And I think it's the Sigmund Bloom thing. I think that's where I heard it first. The idea of going at it in these, 3 or 4 week windows and then reassessing. So in that case, you come into the season, you hope that you got a lot right in your draft rankings before the year. And normally we get quite a bit of stuff right there. You try to build off of that in the first few weeks and you take these shots on some of the breakout players in situations where you think they can make a difference for you throughout the year. And then you reassess it after 3 or 4 weeks and you set yourself up again. The worst thing that you could possibly do is get married to that team that you drafted. And I know there are a lot of people that do that and they look at that team and they're so excited about it after the draft. And then stuff starts happening in the first few weeks and they don't want to change their opinions on it, but that's what you have to do. That's what the smart move is. You have to adapt to this stuff in the first few weeks. And like I said, there is no one answer to it. It's case by case. And I think we're going to talk about some of these.
Yeah, look, I also think it's one of those things where you don't want to get too high and you also don't want to get too low. You should recognize what's going on, but you also should do your best to poke holes in every argument that you see, right? So good example, I talk about this in my mailbag episode, the New England Patriots offense. They've been so pass heavy to start the season. Hunter Henry's looked like a legit tight end option, but when you give that some context, his target share really hasn't been that great. I mean, it's 18th among tight ends pre-Thursday night football. They've just been throwing the ball a lot because look at their opponents. They played Philadelphia week 1, Miami week 2. I think you and I would both be shocked if New England throws the ball at the same rate week 3 against the Jets without Aaron Rodgers, And I think having that sort of context, and another great example is the Steelers, like you mentioned. They play two good fronts. We know the Steelers' offensive line has been an issue the last couple of years, and even entering this year, still an issue. You play against two of the best fronts in football. This isn't, it's a shocking result in that they've been so bad and so awful, but at the same time, at least give them a chance, one chance, two chances against a moderate to below average defense, which they're facing this weekend, and then sort of assess moving forward that way. So I'm not shocked that you and I see it similarly, where we're just trying to take as rational of approach as possible with these first couple of weeks.
Yeah, it makes it tough, but it is also, like I said, that's part of the fun of this, right? And I had Dwayne McFarland on my show yesterday, and we talked a little bit about something like this. And one of the conclusions that Dwayne came to was, if everything went the way we expected it to go, well, that wouldn't be any fun at all, right? That's
True.
Part of why we love this, is that at the beginning of the year, you want to know that some of this stuff is right from what you thought during the summer. You want to find out what's wrong and try to correct that as quick as possible. And then that's the fun. You got to manage your team throughout the year.
So one of the things that you're known for is not only I think your rational sort of approach and take to the game, but you've been an unbelievable ranker in the past. What do you think has sort of driven that success for you, and why have you found success in doing that?
I honestly don't know. It's not the kind of thing where I could just tell people, oh, there's this like one special stat that like solves everything, and that's what you got to do. I think for me, like, I could go way back with it. Like, I'm incredibly competitive, JJ. And like, this goes back to like when I was a kid. Like, I remember my dad taught me how to play cards when I was probably like, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. And whatever game he taught me, as soon as I knew the rules of the game, I expected I should win every single time, because now I know the rules, right? And I'm not factoring it as a kid. I'm not looking at, the luck of the cards or the skill of the other player in the game or anything like that. I'm just going, I believe in myself. And I think that if I know the rules of this game, I should be the best at it. And that followed me kind of through my life. And I take a lot of pride in my work. So I'm always trying to find ways to, outwork everybody else. And I take a lot of that from football too. Like, I didn't play football until I was in high school. And when I played, that's when I kind of learned like how far you can push yourself in order to try to accomplish something. And I've done that in my career. I've done that in like every aspect of my life. And it's made me better for it. So that's the personal kind of side of things, right? Yeah. Like my competitiveness and all that. That's not what everybody wants to hear. The real answer, JJ, and this also is like really, really boring. It's just time. It's time spent. Like, I build my schedule during the football season around football. And I accept the fact that I'm not going to have a lot of plans with friends. I am not going to go out drinking a lot. Like, I know that those are things that aren't going to happen for me over those 4 or 5 months. And I'm okay with that. I don't have kids. My wife is very understanding. My family, my friends, they know the situation. They know this is what I'm passionate about right now. And they kind of allow me to do that. So, Sunday to Thursday, it's morning to night. Like, there's kind of nothing else really happening for me life-wise other than just football. And then Friday, it's most of the day. And, after maybe 7 or 8 p.m., I can make some plans and go out Friday night. And then on Saturday, I always joke that it's like, one half is going to be work and one half is going to be fun. So whether that's, morning work and night, fun, vice versa, but it's time spent and going over everything. And every single week I'm left, at that 1 o'clock mark on Sunday when the games kick off, I'm left with a feeling of, I wish I had another 24 hours to go over all of this, right? Like, there's so much data that we're trying to put into our brains. And I mean, some of that stuff you can go like, the historical data you look at, the injuries you're trying to keep up with, not just to the fantasy players, but to all the players that are out there and how that can impact the matchups. I mean, there's just so much, right? The weather and all this different stuff that we're trying to build that puzzle. And then when I sit down to work on the projections and then eventually the rankings, all of that comes out at that moment. So that for me is what it is. It's just time spent. And, I could say that almost everything that I've applied myself to in life, I've been pretty good at. I know how that sounds, but it's true. There's 2 things, JJ, that I am terrible at, and I don't see anything changing there. And it's drawing. I am no artist. I promise you. It's all stick figures for me. If you're playing one of those games where you have to like draw a picture, it looks like I'm a child in that game because I cannot draw and I can't cook. And I've tried and I've made many a mess in the kitchen. I cannot cook, and I'm okay with that at this point. Shout out to all the delivery drivers in my neighborhood. I mean, they really keep me alive this time of year. But aside from those 2 things, whenever I've really dedicated myself to something, I've come out the other side being pretty good at it. And, the fantasy rankings thing, because of that Fantasy Pros contest, I think, and because of my desire to finish first and my expectation that eventually I could, I really, really threw myself into that one. So, like I said, there's no magical stat, there's no crystal ball, there's no, genie in a bottle who granted me wishes or anything like that. I wish it was a much better story. I wish I had, something to tell people that they could follow, but it's really been hard work and competitiveness and just trying to refine that process year over year. And, one thing I always point to, a mistake that I feel like I was making in the past, was using historical data from too far back. Like going past, 3 or 4 years, I eventually found that things changed so much that was kind of hurting my projections and the stuff I was doing. So when I made that change several years ago, that made a big difference for me. And that's more for like the preseason rankings for the summer stuff, not so much for the in season, but that was one that definitely factored in. But yeah, I wish I had something more to give people that they could follow, but it's really just having a very understanding group of family and friends who are going to allow you to spend that much time on it.
I feel that for sure. Do you ever get like when the 1:00 games hit and let's say the first half hour of a game is going and it started and you start to see a trend with a certain player, right? And you didn't necessarily foresee that happening with that player. And then you start to see in hindsight that there were signs that could have happened, right? And you just got it wrong. I think that the listener, whoever's listening to this right now, or just the average fantasy consumer, needs to realize that there are going to be things. This is where I think the idea out there that fantasy experts and fantasy analysts don't know any more than the average Joe playing fantasy football. I think that idea sort of stems from the fact that there are things that you or I aren't gonna necessarily have top of mind all the time. Before a game starts on set. Last week, perfect example. Last week, for whatever reason, Josh Reynolds was just not near top of mind as he should have been for me, right? And it wasn't until, I had a conversation with some patrons and some folks on Discord where I was like, yeah, that was just a blind spot for me in that given week. And I think that these blind spots are naturally going to happen because, like you said, there's just so much stuff that we're pouring over. And injuries are happening, especially, mid-season and late season when the injuries are just out of control. All these injuries are happening. You're trying to stay up on all these injuries, and it's tough. Do you find yourself in those positions too, where this given week, it just happened that way, and I'm sorry, I'm human. I'm doing my best here. Hopefully I'm winning far more than losing for anyone who's taken my advice, but this is just the reality of the situation with how things kind of unfold.
Yeah, there's just so much information to try to keep on top of, so many players. That's why I wonder, like, if we were doing NBA or something like that, would it be easier? Like, there's less players to focus on. Like, I don't know if that's true or not. I've never really dove too far into basketball fantasy, but yeah, I totally feel that. And it's also funny sometimes, like you'll see, depending what's going on with your specific fantasy teams and where you might be spending more time. If you're trying to trade for a player, you might do more research on that guy in a given week. Or if you're going to try to pick up someone off the waiver wire, you might dive deeper into the team that he's on. So you end up finding a nugget about another player on his team that ends up helping you in the rankings or, with what you're doing that week. So yeah, there's just so many things. I wish I could clone myself and have a bunch of versions of me all working on it and that we could come together at the end. But even still, I think there'd be things that you miss. Yeah. I think it's such a giant like mosaic that you're trying to bring together. And, whether you want to call it a puzzle, whatever, you're trying to bring all of it together. And it's almost impossible to do properly and to do, with 100%. And you go back to, if you want to talk about like the accuracy stuff, when I was in the Fantasy Pros contest back in the day, they used to give you a percentage of like how accurate you were. It wasn't like a point system like they do now. And even in my best seasons, it was like high 60s, low 70s. Yeah. I think that was like you were just crushing it at that point. Like you were so far ahead of everyone else, and still you're way off on a bunch of stuff. So it happens.
Yeah. Well, that's what I tell people too all the time is that, like Puka Nacua, for instance, right? I liked Nacua entering the season. I had him in my draft guide as a late round dart. I don't say that from the perspective that I'm bragging or backpatting. I'm simply saying that I liked him, right? I'm not going to go around today and say that I expected him to have 10 more targets than Justin Jefferson after week 2, And so I think that the lesson here is that we're going to miss stuff, or there's going to be things that we have blind spots for, like I said. But the lesson here is that we just have to be a little bit better than our competition. That's what I always try to drive home to people, is that you're going to be wrong throughout a season. There's going to be players that you drop that you look back and you're like, I should not have dropped that player. You're going to have those moments, but at the end of the day, you're going to have, you have to also focus on the moments that you got right and that went your way. And those moments, if you're following the right advice, if you're, if you have a strong process yourself, those moments at the end are going to outweigh, the bad moments. Just try your best to not fixate on those negative moments. Speaking of negative moments, I'm sure a lot of people are now sitting here wondering what in the world is going on with this Minnesota backfield. A lot of people drafted Alexander Mattison fairly high, drafted Cam Akers fairly high. And would you look at that? They're now both in the same backfield. I mean, think about a month ago, if we were to say that Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers would be in the same backfield, it would be a very shocking thing to hear. So I want to know your take on that backfield, moving forward. Are you very, very worried about Mattison? Are you very, very worried about Cam Akers? Do you think that it just doesn't matter and they're both kind of just irrelevant fantasy assets? Where are you at?
So I think this goes back to what we were saying before about matchups early in the season. And it kind of had Mattison in the back of my mind too, when I was talking about a lot of that stuff, because we knew going into the year that, he's not a gifted running back. He's not like an elite talent at the position. That's not why we were drafting him. If he were, you would have been taking him in the first or second round, not in like the fifth or sixth, or, you could get him even later than that earlier in the year. But he needed the volume. He needed the right run out. And he runs into essentially a buzzsaw going against the Buccaneers run defense, which has been good for so many years with Vita Vea there. And then the Eagles front, which is so strong too. And it makes it very, very difficult for a guy like him to perform, on top of the fact that they got hit with a ton of offensive line injuries. So they're trying to go up against those monster fronts, and they're trying to do it with a diminished offensive line. And that's going to make it very difficult for a guy like Mattison to perform. And, you could look at some of the game scripts and stuff there too, but he was the, 3-down back. That was great. He's getting that kind of usage. He saved the first fantasy day with the touchdown. So it wasn't the worst thing in week 1. And so moving forward, I was kind of still excited. I kind of looked at him like a buy low, and maybe he still is, because now the price is going to be incredibly low for him. So you might still be able to take a shot on him, but they go out, they get Cam Akers. They didn't really spend much to get him. I mean, you look at what they traded, and it was almost like the bare bones. It was like 20 or 2000.
It was irrelevant.
Yeah, 26, pick swap, late round pick swap or something like that. So that really doesn't matter. But Akers comes in, and in my mind, he's kind of a talent like Mattison. So if Mattison has these first 2 bad games, and that's in the mind of the coaching staff, and now if he doesn't come out in the 3rd game or the 4th game here and start to produce, then they're going to make a switch, or they're going to make it into more of a committee. So I still think Mattison has a shot to be the guy there. I wouldn't go crazy about the quotes from the offensive coordinator today. I saw that saying, they still have faith that Mattison and Ty Chandler can produce. What's he going to say, right? I always laugh at those kind of quotes. So they're just, the guys on the team, they're obviously going to say nice things. No one's going to come out and say something terrible about, the coaching staff or the players on the team, unless I guess you're Justin Fields, but that's another story. So I still think that Mattison can end up coming through as that, low end RB2, or maybe now you value him more as a high end RB3 that has that RB2 upside, but he's really going to have to show it over the next couple of weeks. And then I think that Cam Akers is just a bench stash that you're hoping that, if you're the owner of him, you're really hoping that Mattison, fumbles it here and continues to actually literally fumble it away, and that Akers is going to get his shot. And if he does, and if the matchups are right, I think Akers could produce in that offense. But I don't think this is a scenario where they traded for Akers and he's going to come in and immediately be the number 1. I think he's going to have to earn that job, and it's probably going to require Mattison to really stumble or continue to stumble here and not perform. But the matchups do get a little bit better, and hopefully that offensive line will get a little healthier, and we'll see Mattison actually produce a bit for fantasy, like at least I expected him to before the season, and give you those RB2 numbers.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable take. I look at both of these backs as fairly average. Like, I don't think that they necessarily stand out as like super talents. And, at the end of the day, and I say this a lot on the show, but coaching decisions are what drive volume in fantasy football. We have to hope that talent is winning out. We look at the Jets backfield and we say, okay, Breece Hall needs to see more touches because he's clearly the most talented and best running back in that backfield. And we can then feel confident about moving forward and saying, as analysts, yeah, buy Breece Hall because, it's going to only get better for him because he is the best talent in that backfield. Or, other backfields, like when Ezekiel Elliott goes to New England, it wasn't all was not over for Ramondre Stevenson when that happened, because the talent gap between Stevenson and Elliott is fairly evident. It's still there. The talent gap to me between, and I think you were alluding to this, it's like they're both kind of average backs. You get Cam Akers stepping in, and Madison clearly kind of, on the down, at least with the coaching staff and the way that they might be viewing him. And so I agree. I think that the next week or two is going to say a lot about the way that Alexander Madison's season goes. I think there's a chance that we end up seeing a committee in this backfield where they rotate drives. I think there's a chance that Cam Akers ends up being the better running back, that he might have more upside than Madison. I mean, there's just a lot of outs and avenues, but I do agree that Madison's going to at least probably get a shot just because, he has that opportunity in week 3 at least, with Akers joining that team midweek. You can't, from a projection standpoint, you can't sit there and say he's going to get double-digit touches, here in week 3. That's a lot to put on the dude's plate when he just joins the team. So
yeah, if they were desperate, maybe you get a guy in there. Running back's probably the one position where you could do that, but I don't think they are desperate. Yeah. I think they'll be okay running out there with Madison and potentially Chandler this week, and then we'll see going forward.
I still think Ty Chandler is the most explosive. Like if you're just looking at it from that perspective, not necessarily the best every down who can, just carry this massive workload, but he has that explosion. He has that ability. He's very, very fast. He has that ability to be a good change of pace. I really wanted him to get some opportunity, but with Cam Akers there, it looks like that's, at least in the short term, not going to happen. Speaking of explosive running backs, Jahmyr Gibbs, man, he's looked decent when he's touched the ball so far this year. He just hasn't touched the ball a whole lot.
Yeah.
Now you got this David Montgomery injury, so we're hoping that we see a little bit more Jahmyr Gibbs this week, but there's this voice in the back of our head remembering and talking to us about how the Lions used DeAndre Swift. This coaching staff used DeAndre Swift specifically last year. Are the Lions going to finally let Jahmyr Gibbs do some work this week against Atlanta? Or is this going to be a situation where we're just going to be frustrated because the Lions, yes, they spent good draft capital on him, but they might end up just using him like DeAndre Swift?
I do think that it's probably going to be a little closer to the second thing, but this certainly opens the door for him to absolutely blow up here, right? Like the fact that Montgomery's out of the way will probably result in at least a few more touches going Gibbs's way. But I think that the path was laid out here for Gibbs to really explode for fantasy, regardless of whether Montgomery was healthy or not, right? I think that Montgomery could still be out there, and this week or next week or as we go here, Gibbs was eventually going to become the star and be the playmaker in that backfield. I think that's what the Lions wanted. Now, are they going to make him a workhorse? Absolutely not. He's just not that guy. I don't think there'd be any reason for them to do that or to rush him. They're going on this path that they have laid out. And so probably will be Craig Reynolds. I think this week you look at Gibbs, and to me, high-end RB2, maybe even fringe low-end RB1. He can be that kind of player in this offense. He doesn't need 25 touches in order to produce like that because he's so explosive, because he's getting that pass-catching work. But you look at Craig Reynolds to me and you say, Craig Reynolds probably a flex, I would guess, at this point. And being sort of that poor man's David Montgomery. They also have Zonovan Knight or Bam Knight, as some people like to call him. He could be the guy. I mean, they promoted him. People remember him from what he did with the Jets last year. He's a guy that could potentially step in and get some work. But to me, Craig Reynolds, he flashed last season a little bit when he got opportunity. I think he could step in and do a pretty good imitation of David Montgomery out there. And I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see Gibbs continue to kind of play the way he's playing with a few more touches every week because it's not Montgomery and because it's somebody like Reynolds. And then Reynolds, a sneaky guy that I know there's probably a lot of Nick Chubb managers that went out and ended up getting Craig Reynolds that are going to have to slot him in there. And that's very, very sad, but it's a guy that could potentially get you through the next couple weeks and get you all the way, to where you need to go until you can find a true replacement. Because I don't think Reynolds is ever going to become that.
Yeah, and look, it's not like doom for Jahmyr Gibbs either. I mean, every backfield is basically a committee right now, right? I mean, if you look across the league, this is just the way that backfields operate. So the fact that Craig Reynolds is going to see some work doesn't mean that Jahmyr Gibbs is not. I think I still have him ranked as like RB 9 or 10 this week, Jahmyr Gibbs, just because, the situation, the upside is certainly there, and there's some injuries and stuff going on with some of these other guys. And, I don't think it's that hard to see him being an RB1 this week. But, to your point, in a lot of other circumstances, if we knew that Jahmyr Gibbs, like if we knew right now that Jahmyr Gibbs was going to be a true bell cow this week, like I'm talking 15 plus carries, seeing a target share in that 15 to 20% range. If we knew that was happening, he'd be a top 3 or 4 back more than likely from a rankings perspective and from a projection perspective. So
yeah, I love what you said too about like the amount of backfields that we don't have workhorses in.
Oh yeah.
And it's hilarious. Like going into the year, you figured, okay, well, Derrick Henry's probably still going to be that guy. But then all of a sudden, Tajay Spears is getting like almost the equal amount of snaps. And before the season, Christian McCaffrey, everything we were hearing out of the 49ers was, no, this year they're worried about it. They're going to, split touches more. They're going to get other guys involved. And then he comes out and he's basically a 100% player in that offense right now.
Yeah.
Like it's so funny trying to project these backfields. And yeah, it gets to a point where you're not as worried if you don't have one of these guys that can give you 25 touches a week, because not many teams do.
Right. It makes those elite guys in fantasy, and this has been the case for a really long time, but makes those like truly, truly elite guys, like the Christian McCaffrey right now. And then, but it's crazy. You look at the landscape and the high end guys, Tony Pollard, Bijan Robinson, they're not even necessarily the bell cows of old. Like even them, right? Even those players, or even Austin Eckler, right? To some degree. These players, like we're sort of shifting into this world where efficiency is starting to matter a lot more than it did, 5 to 10 years ago with the running back position, where before the Najee Harris types, what we thought or what many thought from Najee Harris entering the season from a volume perspective, that could have gotten you by, and it would have been fine. But because these running backs are separating themselves so much from an efficiency standpoint, I think that's also separating themselves then, as the elite players, because so many of these backfields are indeed split. And then you get the unicorns like CMC, and if he continues to play, like he's playing right now, then from a usage standpoint, then it's just game over.
Yeah.
Speaking of these rookies, so we just talked about Jahmyr Gibbs. If you drafted a rookie, let's say Devon Achane, right? I drafted a good bit of Devon Achane. I liked him entering the year. Are you doing your best after week 2 to hold on to that player, or are you letting go of that player for one of the hot waiver ads?
So I forget who said this. I had an analyst on my show several years ago, and they brought up the idea that they don't like to draft rookies in the late rounds because they just pick those guys up off the waiver wire in week 3 or week 4 when everybody else drops them because they were impatient and they didn't produce yet, right? And I always thought that was such a smart idea, maybe not to avoid rookies in the late rounds entirely, but the idea of being really mindful about who's getting dropped on the waiver wire around this time of year and trying to jump on those rookies specifically, even if they haven't done anything yet, because you could be the one that has them during that breakout in the second half of the season, which is often when you're drafting rookies later, when it's not the Bijan Robinsons and the Jahmyr Gibbs and the guys who were taken really high, who are going to step in and get a lot of touches right away. When it is those later round guys, I'm drafting them thinking that I'm going to be holding them for a while before I'm actually going to see any results. And it depends on the league. It depends on how deep the benches are, whether you can hold them. And the other thing is it really depends on what your roster looks like after the first couple of weeks. Like if you took a bunch of running backs and they've panned out and you're feeling really good about your running back core, then Achane has a much tougher path to get into your lineup, and maybe you can let go of him and pick up a receiver, let's say, if you're a little weaker at receiver, and grab a Josh Reynolds, somebody like that who could step in and help you right away. So it really, once again, I'm always going to say this. I'm always going to try to be, level-headed about it. And it's case by case, and it's roster by roster, and trying to figure out where your needs are. But overall, if I'm drafting those guys, I'm expecting to hold on to them for at least 3 or 4 weeks and see a little bit of a sample size to see if they can work their way up the depth chart or start to get some touches, and then how they look on those touches too, right? Like someone like Tajay Spears, who hasn't gotten a ton of work. He's gotten a lot more snaps than we figured he would get, but not, a ton in terms of volume right now, but he's looked outstanding on it. And if Derrick Henry were ever out of the picture there, knock on wood, we don't want to see that happen, but whether it was an injury or a trade or whatever could move Henry out of the way, I think Tajay Spears is going to be a really good running back in the NFL. And it could happen this year if that opportunity arrives for him. But you want to see these guys out there. And that's why Achane, despite everything that we heard in the preseason about him, we just haven't seen much. And yes, he wasn't playing in week one, right? So we only have one game to go off of, and he was third on the depth chart in that game. So again, not much there, but he'll have an opportunity, I would think, this week to do a little bit of something now that I think Salvan Ahmed is going to be out, and we're still waiting a couple weeks on Jeff Wilson here. So perhaps he'll get his shot this week, but it's been very strange in terms of everything we heard from the teammates and the coaching staff about how unbelievable he was, and the beat writers saying that he was impressing every single day out there. And maybe the injury in late August, maybe that impacted him and that's held him back a little bit, but it really seemed like that positive drumbeat was there. And then for him to come out and, be so far down the depth chart, it's a little bit odd. And if you need help elsewhere, a guy like A-Chain, I think you could potentially let go, but I'd try to hold on to him if you could.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. I got a question about Quentin Johnston on the mailbag this week, and I actually researched and looked at historically over the last decade, looking at wide receivers and how they performed, as rookies through the first 2 weeks of the season, and how that correlated with how they then performed from week 3, to the end of the year. And obviously, there's pockets, as you mentioned, you kind of look at the seasons and groupings and such. But there is a decent correlation between how well guys perform at the beginning of the year to how well they perform through the rest of the year. And, even someone like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who when he was a rookie and he broke out at the end of the year and he was a league winner, the first part of the season, he wasn't usable, but he was still scoring like 4 to 5 fantasy points a game, through the first few weeks of the season. That's where the worry then comes in with a player like QJ, where he's not even seeing the field. And even when he's on the field, he's not doing what Marvin Mims did last week, where Mims, has a decent fantasy performance on 5 routes run, So like a guy like Mims, you feel a little bit more optimistic about that. Okay, they let him, if they just unleash him a little bit more, then maybe he could produce and be a viable option for you. So he's a little bit easier to hold on to. But someone like QJ, look, like I said, there's going to be decisions that you have to make in fantasy throughout a season, and you're going to make decisions that burn you in the end. And that's a decision that might end up burning you in the end if you drop Quentin Johnston right now. But sometimes you have to make those choices because you need to get a Josh Reynolds or someone off the waiver wire in order to play them that week. Those are just sort of the tough decisions you got to make.
And I'm sure we've all been burned like that. I immediately comes to mind David Johnson during his rookie season.
Yeah.
Held him all year. I think I dropped him a week or two before he finally blew up down the stretch and ended up becoming an amazing keeper in that league for a different league mate who ended up picking him up off the waiver wire. So that was one that to this day still hurts a little bit. So thanks for bringing that up, JJ.
Yeah. Look, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. One of the players, I've been bringing this up on the show. I actually did that in a league with Puka Nacua before week 1 this year. And it was a situation where I'm like, I got enough Puka Nacua around my leagues. I got enough exposure. He's not going to blow up week 1. And then, of course, everything goes the way that it does. So we got Nacua right now, who I actually have ranked, I think, as a top 24 guy at this point moving forward. I think in my rest of season rankings. Kyron Williams, I have ranked as a solid RB2 rest of season. Both of those rankings compared to consensus were higher. So I'm higher than the consensus on those two players. Where are you at? Let me ask you this in particular. Are you worried about Nacua when Cooper Kupp returns? If Cooper Kupp returns, I should say. Yeah,
I think that's the aspect of this that people aren't talking enough about. And these are certainly the two guys that I was referencing before, where I had Puka as the top pickup after week 1. But I looked at it and I said, well, Cooper Kupp's going to be back eventually. And yeah, you might get great production for the first month. But then if Cooper Kupp comes back, what does he end up being? And, maybe the Rams, it was a divisional game in week 1. And maybe the Rams, it's just a little bit of a mirage in that game and they'll fall back to earth the next week. But then they come out and they do it all over again against an even tougher opponent in week 2, right? So they definitely seem legit, and all the credit in the world goes out to Matthew Stafford, who looks like he's, still in his prime right now. Yeah. And Deshaun McVay and the play calling there has been fantastic, and that helps all these guys. And we could even throw in like Tutu Atwell has been outstanding too. He's getting overshadowed, but like he's putting up great stats the first 2 weeks. So I'm curious to see what happens in this next game. They'll be on Monday night, I believe, going against the Bengals, and we might not have Joe Burrow. So, how much are they going to have to throw in that game? That'll be a whole different story. And, I'm sure you'll get into that in other episodes, but rest of the season, I'm kind of right there with you, maybe even slightly higher. If I look at my rest of the season rankings here, I have Kyron as the RB 15, and I have Puka as the wide receiver 22.
Yep.
So if you think back to like, where that would have been if we knew this, if we knew now what we knew, we know if we knew then what we knew, what we know now, I think they would have been like fourth or fifth round picks. And the thing with Puka is he's going to give you this outstanding production in the first month. So we got another couple weeks here, and we don't know for sure that Cooper Kupp is going to be back in week 5.
Right.
There's been some reports that they think he's going to come back in week 5. I hope that he comes back in week 5, but it's certainly no guarantee. It could be longer than that. And for however long he's out, like Puka now is in my top 12 this week. I think he has to be in that range moving forward in any game that Cooper Kupp's not playing. So he gives you that incredible value. And then when Kupp comes back, because of what we've seen, now it's been 2 weeks, and that's still a small sample size, but because of what we've seen in these 2 weeks, I do feel more confident that Puka's going to continue to produce, not in the same way necessarily once Cooper Kupp's back, but that he's still going to be a fantasy starter. He's still going to have value as that, low end wide receiver 2, high end wide receiver 3, and everybody wants to compare him to Robert Woods, and it's a valid comparison.
Yeah.
But we saw at one point when, this offense was humming a few years ago that Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods were both performing as top 20 guys. So it's certainly possible that this continues. But I don't feel like I've seen enough discussion about the idea that when Cooper Kupp comes back, that, Puka could fall off quite a bit. And, week, 8, you might start wondering about those 100% bids or whatever it was that people were putting in on him after week 1. And that's not me trying to backtrack. I'm taking the L. Like, I think I was putting in, I recommended like a 15% bid after week 1. So just incredibly low versus what people were actually spending to get him, which was, 50, 60, 70% or more. So I'm taking the L on that for sure, because he's going to help all those teams that picked him up, be potentially 3-1 or 4-0 to start the year. But yeah, it's certainly going to be concerning when Cooper Kupp returns. It's going to change things quite a bit in that offense. And that's the fun of this, right? You can be right and you can be wrong. I could be wrong about that bid, but then midway through the season, maybe it looks like, people shouldn't have spent that much, and things will continue to change along the way, and we'll keep adapting.
Yeah, it's a roller coaster. The whole season's a roller coaster. You easily take L's one week and then they're W's the next week. That happens all the time. I do think that the market seems to at least be embedding not necessarily Cooper Kupp's return, but a mirage, right? This idea that Puka Nacua isn't this good or that he can't maintain this. But I think that you're right that this production, the way that they're using him, the target share he's seeing, and the way the offense is operating, I don't know if he's going to maintain a 40% target share, over the next 2 or 3 weeks if Cooper Kupp is out during that time. But a 30% share, sure, I think that's doable for him to maintain something like that, maybe a 25% share. And so you're getting that elite production, over the next couple of weeks, and then I do still think that this could just be a Robert Woods-esque role afterwards, where if Matthew Stafford continues playing at this level, then all of a sudden Nacua is indeed still a wide receiver 2 for your team, and he's fine. So that's why I have him ranked right now as that wide receiver 2, because I think that he has that ability to maintain that. And again, if you look at consensus and stuff right now, he's more ranked as a wide receiver 3, probably because a little bit of the Cooper Kupp stuff, but also I think there's still a lot out there who are just like, this isn't real. Like, because this is historic. Like, we don't see this happen. Not only do we not see day 3 picks, immediately produce at wide receiver in general, like this, but doing it like this, doing it in a way where he's not just producing, he's just straight up dominating. I mean, he is literally Justin Jefferson in fantasy football. And that's something that I think it's very easy to say, oh, he's not going to maintain that. No, he's not. But it's then easy to say, oh, I'm going to rank him, or I'm going to push him down my board, this far. But it's easy to kind of overstate that just because, you're thinking he's just not going to maintain this.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of it is just the scheme and how much of it is Puka actually like showing that mind meld with Stafford and showing that kind of veteran savvy. And there was a lot of talk that Cooper Kupp's been kind of talking him up and training him and trying to teach him as much as he can. But the fact that he's out there and reading defenses the way that he is, and he's kind of getting into those spots for Stafford, like those are the things to me that I was very excited to see continuing in week 2, that it wasn't just a fluke because of that he actually was showing like he's almost playing like a veteran. And to do that as a 5th round rookie, it's almost incredible, on top of the fact that the numbers are just out of this world.
Are you more confident in Puka Nakua's ability and talent to sort of maintain, not to this degree, but I mean like, fantasy relevancy, let's say? Or are you more confident in Kyron Williams? But is it more so like if the answer is Williams, is that more so dictated by the fact that he's playing running back and he's just seeing volume, or is it really a talent thing for you?
I mean, it's not a talent thing. It would just be pure volume, and I would have to go with Kyron there, right? Like the guy's getting, we're talking about CMC being almost 100% player. Kyron's basically almost been a 100% player, right? So if there's a running back in an offense that's doing this well, I think you would have to side with him, despite the fact that Puka has been just outstanding and, all pro almost through 2 weeks here in terms of his production.
Yeah, I'm with you. With running backs, I mean, talent matters. You obviously want to analyze the player for who they are because they can rise depth charts and stuff. I didn't foresee, I was fading Cam Akers to start the year, but I was doing it because, there's so many reports about Kyron Williams being involved in the offense. But this is another situation where I wasn't then targeting Kyron Williams because of that. I thought it was just going to be a more dig into his workload and not allow him to be, this great fantasy asset. Kyron to me wasn't that unbelievable. He was just a very solid prospect. And then he had that horrible speed score and he had all those issues from a testing standpoint. And it was hard to really like back him as this. And I think that he's taken a step forward, at least, this year from last year to this year. And he definitely looks better and looks the part more. I do in the back of my mind, this is late round perspective, so I throw out some more fire takes than I do on the late round podcast. I do in the back of my mind still question his ability to do this the whole year, just to be, but I look at that depth chart and I'm like, the other two backs on that team right now, and Ronnie Rivers and Zach Evans, wasn't a big fan of theirs either from a prospecting standpoint. And so strictly from that, I'm fine. Like I said, that's part of the reason why I put him at RB2 and have him as a rock solid RB. I think I have him in like the RB16 or so range. That's part of the reason why, is because I don't know if that competition in the backfield is strong enough. If there was a prospect back there that I loved, that I was really, really into, and look, there's a lot of Zach Evans truthers. Maybe you're one too, but there's a lot of people who like Zach Evans, and I get it. I totally get it. I just wasn't one that was really that on him. To me, if you like Zach Evans in particular, then you probably should be a little bit less bullish on a player like Kyron, because it's not like he entered the league as this stud prospect. And it's not like he's shown up as a stud player. But to me, because of the lack of competition, I can buy into Kyron a little bit more.
I like Evans, but what we've seen so far, that changes the game, right? The fact that Evans was so far down the depth chart and the fact that Kyron's doing what he's doing. The only thing that I've seen, and I don't think it's going to happen, but the only thing that I've seen that would concern me just even a tiny little bit about Kyron is that the Rams could trade for Jonathan Taylor. That would be at this point, right? Like that's the only thing now that could like bump him out of the way. There's no other back that's coming in to take his job.
Well, they were rumored, right? Before they were
apparently in on him.
They were, look, I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, it's a reporter that's just reporting it. It's not like Sean McVay's coming out and saying like, yeah, we were trying to get Jonathan Taylor. But yeah, I mean, they were at least attached to that. And that was one of those moves where everyone's like, of course the Rams are looking, like no one thought the Rams were going to be competitive. And then of course they were going after a running back when they have so many other holes to fill. Speaking of running backs, Jerome Ford, we now have him as seemingly the 1A in this backfield with Nick Chubb out. What do you think about Jerome Ford? Were you, on team or in leagues where he was out there, were you aggressive on the waiver wire? Do you think he could be a league winning type player?
It's so funny because normally I'm like the most aggressive early in the season. Normally after the first few weeks, I've just blown all my budget. And yet this year I held back a little bit. So with Jerome Ford, as everyone was screaming, 100% bid on him, I put him down as a 50% bid just because I wasn't sure what moves they were going to make and who else they could potentially bring in there. And then the other thing that I think is so important here, and I think we're going to find out more about this when people are losing their minds on Twitter or X about it, probably on, Sunday or early next week, is the matchups that he has coming up, right?
Yes.
He's got the Titans this week, and the Titans are shutting down everybody. They just ruined the waiver wire dreams of Josh Kelly last week, so they might do it again here. Then he has the Ravens the week after, then a bye, then the 49ers. So you have a month where it's like very, very tough matchups on top of the fact that Kareem Hunt's joining. And I'm not worried about Kareem Hunt in terms of like taking over the job. I don't think Kareem Hunt's that player anymore. You look back to last season, I don't think Kareem Hunt looked particularly great last year. And then what they did, right, in the offseason, they chose Ford over Hunt. And then the whole
Exactly.
thing about like they made him try out, that was just, come on, guys, like you're gonna bring him back. Like that's so rude to make him try out and all that. But that to me says that they're gonna roll with Ford here, and it's gonna be kind of like the Alexander Madison situation where he's gonna get his shot. And if he can't handle it, then it probably will turn into more of a 50-50 committee or something like that. And I worry that because of these matchups, he's not going to produce very well. And so he's someone that I think 2 weeks from now, as they're going into their bye, and after he's probably had two like average to below average games, he's going to be a buy low. I'm telling you right now, I'm going to be talking about it on my show. I'm going to say go out and buy Jerome Ford before their bye. And the manager that has him is going to be worried that he hasn't produced. And then the guy's going to be going on his bye week and they're not going to be able to use him. And you're probably going to be able to get him cheap. And then maybe after that 49ers matchup, particularly, then he could potentially, blow up or explode for fantasy. And at that point, I'm looking at him as an RB2. I'm not really going crazy on him, but a top 20 guy at that point, even with Hunt around, because I think Hunt is just going to be that kind of complementary piece. And we saw it. I mean, it's a much different situation. We're talking about Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb talent wise, but I still just don't think that Kareem Hunt is a starting running back in the NFL anymore. So I'm not too worried about him taking over the job there. I think Ford is going to have his day, but I think it's not going to come maybe for like a month.
Yeah, I said the exact same thing on my mailbag episode. You look at that schedule, it's scary, and you have to, in these situations, my fear is how the coaching staff responds. You look at Minnesota, they responded in a way where they said, we're going to trade for Cam Akers. And, if they do struggle a little bit running the ball, and they point to that and they use Jerome Ford as like a scapegoat. They use this injury as sort of to Nick Chubb as sort of the reason why, without giving all of that context, then you can see a path where this does not go in the right direction. But I think that we're both seeing this exactly the same way, where I believe Jerome Ford's the most talented running back in that backfield with Kareem Hunt, entering the picture. I didn't mind Pierre Strong either as a prospect necessarily, but he's not a player that's going to be able to handle a decent workload. Jerome Ford, is kind of in that like Ty Chandler mold where he's got that explosion and he's got that ability to break off big. We saw that on Monday night against Pittsburgh, or was that Sunday night against Pittsburgh? It was Monday night, right?
Was it Monday? Yeah, the two games the same night. That's what's messing you up.
That's what's messing me up. Yeah, that is what's messing me up. But we saw his big playability in that game where he goes to one side of the field and he just runs the complete opposite side, beats defenders, runs out of gas a little bit right at the inch yard line. But he does have that big playability. And if he can get one of those, if we get one of those against Tennessee this weekend, then I think that could really, really salvage this concern that we have of him maybe not performing, and then the Browns coaching staff saying, yeah, we're gonna divvy this up a little bit more, or we're gonna do something crazy and stupid and trade for a running back or do something insane to improve that position. One of the reasons why I really like doing this show is because I have the 15 transactions episode that I do earlier in the week where I'm giving these recommendations and I'm not talking to other analysts because I'm just trying to get content out the door. And I love to get analyst reactions then to some of those transactions. One of them this week was with Jordan Love, and I had Jordan Love as a sell. There's a lot of regression-related stuff going on with him, and some of the pushback that I've gotten since that are people saying, well, he's doing this with rookies. He's doing this with, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, no Aaron Jones, no Christian Watson. How could it possibly get that much worse? Do you think I'm stupid for saying that Jordan Love is a sell?
No, I think you're bringing me on the show just to talk about how great you are and how this is definitely the right take and this is 100% accurate. No, I mean, you look at it, I think this one's pretty obvious. Like, he's certainly not going to continue to produce the way he's been producing. I haven't seen anything from him. I think it's been better than, certainly what we saw in years past in those small glimpses that we got. I think he's come a long way, and now he's a guy that he's out there, he's playing within himself, and he can execute that system in Green Bay, and he's doing a pretty good job of that. So kudos to him for that. And the fact that he's doing it without Christian Watson and these younger guys. And also that's so fun, like, that they just have all these young players and they're going to let them grow together. It's kind of great. I'm really excited to follow that. But then when you look what he's done, right? Like, he's 28th in pass attempts and he's tied for first in touchdowns. Like, that kind of thing's just never going to continue. Like, there's just no possible way. So he's going to come back to earth. I don't even see him being like a top 10 fantasy quarterback. I think he's going to settle in more as like a high end QB2 and a guy that in that system with all those weapons, when everybody's healthy, he'll be able to produce some good games. But he's also going to get a big test here. He's going against the Saints defense this week. So I'm kind of interested to see what happens in that game, because I think that's definitely the spot where he could come back to earth. But then I think he has a couple good matchups after this. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't shock me if he does continue to produce, but certainly somebody that I think people should be selling high on. If there's anybody in your league that's willing to buy on Jordan Love, I would sell on him for sure, because there's no chance that he's going to continue. He's like the quarterback 2 right now.
Let me ask you this. I put a poll out there on X, on Twitter, whatever, asking people who they like more rest of season in fantasy. And the 2 options were Jordan Love and Justin Fields. And Jordan Love won that poll 58-42.
Wow.
So where do you, that was kind of my reaction too.
I would still be going Fields.
Yeah, right. Like that's where I think a lot of people are with Love, is that he's been fine from a fantasy perspective, and they see that his weapons are gone. But here's a stat that I threw up on the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram this week. Jordan Love has thrown a touchdown on every 66 passing yards to start the year. And yards correlate to touchdowns. I mean, this is a way to spot regression pretty easily. Matthew Stafford has thrown a touchdown for every 641 passing yards. Okay. The league average this year is a passing touchdown on every 173 passing yards.
Yeah.
So we're seeing Jordan Love, regardless of, like, he can get better as a player. And this is where regression and statistics are sometimes hard to sort of talk about and to explain. But Jordan Love can get better as a player, and even get better statistically from like a yards per attempt standpoint, etc. He can get better there with these improved weapons when Aaron Jones and Christian Watson, hopefully they get healthy. Hopefully Christian Watson gets healthy eventually. Yeah. If and when they're healthy, he can get better as a player and still have worse numbers. And that's exactly what I think we're going to see with Love moving forward. I agree. I think he's sort of like a mid QB2 moving forward. This week's going to be tough, but as you noted, and this was the case entering the season, Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis mentioned this on a Late Round podcast when he hopped on, but the Packers passing schedule entering the year was one of the easiest in the league. And I think that we're seeing that sort of come to play, with their upcoming schedule and stuff. So I had Jordan Love as a sell. Do you have any other screaming sell candidates right now across the league?
James Conner probably. Once again, I don't know what you're going to be able to get for him, because he kind of is one of those guys that like has that name and that people kind of have that negative perception about him a little bit, on top of, just what we're looking at with the Cardinals this year. But they've overperformed. I mean, Connor himself has probably overperformed, and he's been good. Like, even when they've had backup quarterbacks in there, he continues to produce on the volume that he gets. But then you look at what's coming up for him, and not to just continuously go back to matchups, but early in the season, I think this factors in a lot to provide like context to what we're seeing. And he gets the Cowboys and the 49ers the next 2 weeks. So
it's rough.
Little bit worried that the numbers aren't going to be as good as they've been so far. He's been the RB 13 and half PPR through 2 weeks. Probably not going to be that during those matchups. So if you can get out on him and get any sort of like, RB2 in return, I would probably be doing that. And then I had Dwayne McFarland of Fantasy Life. He was on my show this week, and we both kind of said the same thing about Garrett Wilson, that we love him to death. We love him so much. And yet we've gotten so lucky with the production that he's had through these 2 weeks with Zach Wilson that it's not going to continue. That we saw what happened when he was playing with Wilson last year. There really hasn't been any indication really that Wilson has improved that much this season, that things are going to change. There's some tough matchups still on the way. It wasn't just last week with the Cowboys. It's going to be the Patriots this week. And right now, Garrett Wilson is kind of surviving on these incredible plays and these touchdowns that he's had the first 2 weeks. It's not going to continue. I mean, right now, I think he's a top 20 receiver in fantasy points per game. I would view him more as like a wide receiver 3 rest of the year. And I think if you can get out on him for a wide receiver 2 price, as sad as that is, I mean, when I put out my rest of season rankings yesterday, JJ, it just hurts to my core having to put him as low as I have to put him in there. But that's what we're looking at right now. You got to adapt to the situation, like we've kept saying. So right now, Wilson is somebody that I think you have to try to sell as quick as you possibly can, because the bottom's going to get even lower on this in the coming weeks.
What about on the flip side, a couple guys that you might want to buy right now?
I'm going to say two guys from the same team, actually. And I did this on my show this week, and I'm gonna double up. I'm gonna mention them again here. But Jonathan Taylor, to me, like,
Mm,
he's not going to come back for a couple weeks, but I think this is the time when, like, no one's really talking about him,
yeah.
and you got a couple weeks to go. The manager that has him, they're probably not doing great, I'm guessing. And based on where they took him, they could be struggling. Maybe they got lucky and they got some other players. But if they're 0-2 right now, they definitely need some help. They're going to be worried. You try to get in there and make a bid for him. And we don't know what's going to happen, right? We don't know if he's going to
Yeah.
come back to the Colts after week 4. Is he going to get traded? I still think a trade is the most likely scenario there. And I think when that happens, good luck getting him, because he's going to go to a team where people are probably going to be very excited about him. But I think he's somebody that you should be trying to make that offer for at the moment, because this is probably the time when you're going to get that discount. And as we get closer to, there'll be more headlines and everything, and people start to get a little more excited about him. And you're taking a risk. You have to understand that
Yeah.
he might not come back right away. He might sit out longer. Like, all of those things are built in there. But I think it's worthy of the risk, because if he comes back and he's in a good situation, whether that's the Colts or somewhere else, we know what he can do, right? He could be a top 10, maybe even a top 5 guy. So I think he's somebody to go after. And then I think Anthony Richardson is the other
Mm,
one, and he's probably not going to play this week. I don't know if that's official yet or not, but probably not going to play because he's in concussion protocol. And yet, what we've seen from him so far, he's both looked the part, like, he looks fantastic. He looks so comfortable out there. Credit to the coaching staff there for having him ready to go. And also, he's producing. Like, in week 1, he got it done. He was the QB4 on the week. And then last week, he was crushing it. Like, he was on his way to having like a
oh my
30 or
gosh.
40 point fantasy game.
I know.
And that,
Don't remind me. Don't
I know,
remind me.
that was going to be like the coming out party for him. And then it gets stopped by the fact that, he falls awkwardly after that second rushing touchdown, and doesn't finish the game. And then, now he potentially is going to be out for this week probably. So I think this is the only opportunity you are going to get to try to buy him. And he's somebody that, in my mind, everything we've seen, he can be a top 5, top 6 fantasy quarterback the rest of the season. And you're going to be able to get him right now when maybe his manager doesn't realize, and maybe his manager has another option and they feel pretty good about that option, and they're not going to have him this week. So they might be willing to move him. That's all I'm saying. I think this is the chance, because I think that value is going to skyrocket once he's back out there. And this is a guy that could potentially help you win your league based on what his value is right now and what he could produce the rest of the way.
I love that call. I love that call. Anthony Richardson just looks like he could be a league winner at that position. As much as you can be one, at the quarterback position. Last question I want to ask you, we build projections and we look at this stuff usually from sort of a top-down approach. If the offense is looking good, then that means the players within that offense are looking good. And then the flip side, right? If an offense is struggling, then the players in that offense are also going to struggle. You have Cincinnati, for instance, who has not been performing well for a lot of reasons, and that has impacted literally everyone on that team. So which offense, maybe it's Cincinnati, but which offense has gotten off to a slow start do you think is going to finally turn things around and could really be, a place where people could extract some value in fantasy football?
I think the Bengals could definitely be that team. I mean, as soon as Joe Burrow gets healthy, but the question is he going to get healthy? Are they going to let him sit for a few weeks and get healthy? And I go back to like Jamar Chase in the summer saying like that he wanted Burrow to sit at the beginning of the season so that when he does come back, that he was 100%. And man, that looks like that was a pretty smart call. And they didn't do it. I've heard Stefania Bell talk about this too from ESPN, where she said that she's always angry about the fact that these teams rush to have these guys ready for week 1 when week 1 isn't what matters. Right. And Burrow is the perfect example of, man, if they'd only held him out maybe one more week or a couple more weeks and let him get totally right. Because in that first game, whether it was because he aggravated it or not, he just didn't look like he was himself. And I think you could go into the mechanics of it and how much that injury could have been impacting him, on top of the fact that it was just a monsoon. It was raining quite a bit in that game, and that was impacting it too. But, and I'm not just saying this to play up to you, but I will go back because the Bengals are probably too easy. You mentioned them there. I will go back to the Steelers. I think things are going to get a lot better for the Steelers. And I think it's because those matchups in the first 2 weeks were just so difficult, and people aren't acknowledging that enough. And I like some of the things we've seen from them. I mean, George Pickens looks like he's taken a step forward. That's great. But in better matchups, we're going to see Kenny Pickett be able to do a little bit more. And sure, he's not taking a massive leap. What we saw in the summer in the preseason, it made it seem like maybe there could be a little more there and a potential breakout, but that hasn't arrived. And I don't know that it's going to arrive, but he's going to be able to do enough to support the weapons on that offense. Pat Freiermuth, he had a chest injury in week 1 and he's potentially playing through that. And maybe he's had to, I'm not 100% sure because I didn't go back and look at this specifically yet, but maybe he's been used as a blocker a little bit more because of all the pass rush that's been coming their way the last 2 weeks. But either way, he has not really been involved as a receiver. I would have to think that at some point that's going to change. Deontay Johnson, if he got dropped in your league, I've seen some leagues where that's happened. You get him for sure because when he is healthy, when he comes back from IR, he's going to be good. And then that backfield, as much as everybody wants to dog Najee Harris and say that, Jaylen Warren is better, talent-wise, explosive, yeah, for sure. I think Jaylen Warren probably is the better option there. But when the matchups get better, and they're going to be the next couple of weeks here, Najee's going to find the end zone. Najee's going to have some stats. So I think those guys are both worth starting. I mean, Najee is a fringe low-end RB2, probably more of a high-end RB3, and then Warren as a flex. But let's see that Pittsburgh offense in some better matchups before we completely put them to rest.
Yeah, until this weekend, if they do put up a goose egg against Vegas, then
there you go.
Then we'll be a little concerned. But I agree
100%.
I agree. Justin, thanks so much for hopping on. Why don't you let everyone know where they can find you?
Yeah, all my content's available for free on the Score app. You can go download the Score, but it's not just for my content. I mean, the box scores, all the other content that's on there is fantastic. I think it's the best sports app in the industry. I've been using it long before I worked at the Score too. So that tells you all you need to know about it. And then the Score Fantasy Football Podcast, doing 5 episodes a week right now. Have a guest on every week and have some really big names in the industry, including yourself, which you've always come on for, I think, going back to the first year we did it like 6 years ago. So I appreciate that. And I'm having a ton of fun with the podcast. And I think people should definitely give it a listen. We're trying to cover everything we possibly can early in the season too, to try to catch up on all this stuff, like the things that we talked about today, where we're trying to figure out that puzzle right now so that we have a better shot at doing well later in the year.
For sure. I'm on Twitter at LateRoundQB. All my stuff over on LateRound.com. As usual, check out the Patreon. Make sure you're subscribed to this show, the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast feed. On behalf of me and Justin, thanks for tuning in.